What's up, everybody? Welcome back to our study through the Gospel of Mark. And today we're going to talk about the coming and how Mark portrays the John the Baptizer coming onto the scene. So, Mark introduces John with a word, egenedo, i.e., he appeared or came into being, which in Jewish literary tradition signals the arrival of a prophet or a decisive divine actor, somebody who's playing the game decisively. In history, he's significant. It's the same construction used to introduce prophetic figures in the Old Testament. Okay. And when you go and look at some of the history of the kings and the prophets, like you'll see the same kind of a concept coming into that Mark is drawing off of. So obviously, Mark isn't just saying, "Hey, John, there's some guy coming in." He's actually announcing quite forcefully that someone of prophetic significance has just stepped onto the stage of Israel's covenant history. So John is a baptizer. And so baptism is a Greek word for the Hebrew word mikvah. And it just means water immersion for purification. And this was something that was deeply woven into Jewish life, especially in the Second Temple period. We have a lot of this in the book of Leviticus. When it talks about you shall cleanse yourself or purify yourselves with water or bathe yourselves. It's the same idea. And obviously, so the Torah did prescribe various ritual washings or mikvahs or baptisms, if you want to go to the Greek. Going into the holy space required this because no impurity could go into divine sacred space. It just wasn't permitted to be there. Interestingly, archaeologists in recent history have excavated dozens of mikvaot or ritual immersion pools in Jerusalem and in the Qumran area where the Qumran community was. And we've obviously talked about them quite a bit, but they're key, valuable and important players in the Second Temple period, so we can kind of more rightly understand things in the days of Jesus. So the Qumran community is especially instructive in their community a document that governs the life of the Qumran community. It describes a purification right through water that is explicitly connected to repentance and moral change or transformation. And they were very careful to note that the water itself didn't accomplish anything without genuine covenantal reorientation within the heart first. This is it. So when John is baptizing in the wilderness, and we see this in Mark and Matthew and Luke, he refuses to permit some of these Pharisees and scribes coming from Jerusalem. He calls them a brood of vipers, and John insists that they must produce fruits in keeping with repentance before he qualifies them for his baptism, which is right in line with this here. So what made John's baptism kind of unique and distinctive was two things. One, it appears to have been like a once and for all act rather than a repeated ritual. And it was also explicitly oriented to the coming divine day of judgment, the coming day of the Lord. This wasn't, kind of a routine religious maintenance, but it was a threshold, right? A line, John's baptism was a line being drawn between the way things are now in this fallen, exiled, corruptible, contemptible state of being, state of the covenant, to this new order, this age to come, this day of the Lord that's about to imminently arrive. And so we get the word repentance, okay? Mark uses the word in the Greek, it's metanoia, okay, for repentance. It's usually translated from the Hebrew word teshuva, which means to turn, okay, or a return. So in Second Temple Judaism, this carried both moral and eschatological weight. Remember, eschatological is focused on the end, this future-looking day when God is going to right all the wrongs and, vindicate the righteous, purify the heavens and the earth, all these things. This is what we mean when we say that. And so this baptism of repentance had this kind of a concept in mind. It's looking forward to what's coming. So this wasn't about some psychological remorse or being sorry. It's about covenantal. Remember, this is all working within and from in about the covenant that God makes with Israel that ultimately and eventually will be a blessing for all the nations. So For the people that are within Israel at the time, this is a covenantal realignment, okay, a repositioning of the people within God's purposes in anticipation of the coming judgment and restoration. So let me say that again. So the repentance idea that we have in the New Testament, right? It's covenantal realignment with which means we reposition ourselves as a whole within God's purposes, right? And God's purposes can't be what my purposes are. It might not be what your local church's purposes are. I don't know. I'm not just saying that, but that happens all the time. In anticipation, realigning ourselves to be faithful and pure to the covenant in anticipation of the coming day of judgment and restoration of all things. In archaeology, we have the Damascus document that describes those who repented of the sin of Jacob and held fast to God's commands as the ones who would participate in the eschatological new covenant. Okay? Repentance was preparation for what God was about to do, which is super important, guys. Super important. We need to grasp this. We need to take that home, and we need to reckon with this. And as Paul would say, in 2 Corinthians 13:5, that we would examine ourselves to see whether we actually are in the faith. Mind you, he's not talking to unbelievers when he's saying this. So all of these words here that Mark is communicating, these themes, these concepts, this urgency is supposed to produce in us a heart of submission and a heart of consecration to live in light of this day, just like the followers were in the first century. And then we have the idea of forgiveness of sins, which is the word aphesis in Greek, and it's the same word used in the Greek Old Testament or the Septuagint for the release in the Jubilee year. And so if you remember, the Jubilee year was the one that happened every 50 years on Israel's calendar, in which debts were canceled, slaves were freed, and land was returned to their original owners. So in the American real estate world, every time you want to buy a property, either an attorney or a title company is going to do something called a title search or an abstract of title. And what they're trying to do is to see if the title's marketable and if there's any encumbrances on it, like liens, mortgages, maybe medical bills, personal taxes for the owner, some other, maybe like a judgment for whatever reason. So they're going to look at this. They're also going to look at to see if there's any heirs involved or descendants or descendants of anybody that might have claim to the title of the property. And it goes all the way back to what's called the sovereignty of the soil. And basically when the government or the king owned the land. At least that's how it is here in Texas. I believe it goes back to the Spanish crown, or 1800 is when it goes back to. So the same idea. So in Israel, the land goes back to whoever it was allotted to when Joshua led Israel into the land, which is pretty cool. And so this Jubilee year got developed to be an eschatological concept when all of this stuff was going to happen, because the curses of the Torah had availed themselves, and the people found themselves under the curses or the penalty of the Torah. And this is the language that Paul will use in the New Testament, saying under the law. When Paul says this, it cannot mean abrogation or doing away with or relaxing any of the commandments of God. It just doesn't work. It's not the case. It's not an exegetically defensible interpretation of that. So what he's going to mean is under the curse of the Torah, as we see here at this period of time. Okay. So in the Second Temple worlds, where Jesus came from in the Gospel of Mark came from, the eschatological jubilee, or this final cosmic release, was an expected feature of the age to come. A remarkable Dead Sea Scroll text, 11Q13, or the Melchizedek document, applies jubilee imagery to a heavenly figure who will proclaim liberty to the captives in the last days. And guess what? That's what Isaiah 61 says. That's what Jesus quoted in Luke 4 when he went to the synagogue in Nazareth when they wanted to throw him off the cliff. And he applied that to him. He's the one. He's the eschatological deliverer who's going to steward time and steward the oracles of God and the covenant of God so that these things happen. Okay? which is pretty cool. So John's proclamation of Ephesus places him squarely in that tradition, and he's not offering a new routine priestly atonement. He's just announcing an eschatological end-time release as the Torah and the prophets have promised, the jubilee of the age to come that's imminently on its way. It's imminently going to happen. Interestingly, when Mark says that all Judea and Jerusalem are going out to John, he's using standard Jewish literary device for overwhelming boundary-crossing impact. So it's the same way in the book of Genesis when it says all the world came to Egypt for grain during that famine. And the point is not about quantifying people by like actual legitimate literal number. It's a euphemism or a way of speaking that communicates that John's movement in this case was drawing Israel as a whole. Okay, those who would have ears to hear, those who are responding, those who are living in anticipation of the promises of God and what the prophets have spoken. They're not caught up in the games and the corruption of the kind of the priestly aristocracy. These guys are legitimate people longing for God's vindication, longing for God to intervene in history and to do what he said. It's all of those people are coming out towards a decisive moment, the decisive moment of national reckoning for the people of God. And we're going to end here talking about the Jordan River. So the Jordan River is not a new or a convenient location for baptism. That's not the case. It was one of the most symbolically charged places in the entire Jewish imagination. So it was the boundary of the promised land. It was the boundary of the land promised to Abraham, and the river that Israel crossed with Joshua in a miraculous replaying of the Red Sea. Elijah crossed the Jordan before being taken up into a fiery chariot, and Elisha crossed it to receive the double portion of the Spirit, as the text says. So in Jewish memory, the Jordan River marked a boundary between the wilderness wandering and the covenant inheritance between exile and homecoming. Pretty cool, huh? So coming to the Jordan for purification and then returning would have read to any Jew as an enacted or reenactment of the Exodus entry sequence. So John isn't just washing people in a river. He's actually staging a symbolic new Exodus, rehearsing and preparing people for the coming actual Exodus through the Messiah, inviting Israel to pass through the waters again in preparation for what God is about to do. So this public confession of sins that accompanied the baptism reinforces this. Ezra and Nehemiah led the returned exiles in communal confession as a condition of covenant renewal. And the Qumran community that we've talked about practiced annual collective confession at their covenant renewal ceremony. So John is extending that same kind of covenantal logic and interface to the entire nation, or those who would have ears to hear and do something about it. So this was, this kind of eschatological preparation completely bypassed the entire temple establishment on purpose. So Josephus, one of the first century Jewish historians that's very popular, got a lot of literature, records that other movement leaders in the same period, one of them was Theudas, an Egyptian prophet, were also leading crowds to the Jordan in the wilderness, promising Exodus-like miraculous signs. So this was a supercharged messianic fervor, kind of an idea that was really alive at the time, because they were crying out for, when are you going to do this, God? God, when are you going? How long, oh Lord? When are you going to do this? Why are you waiting? And so John operates within that same recognizable category, right? And so an eschatological prophet, an end-time prophet, offering Israel a new imminent Exodus experience, and this is what distinguishes him. What distinguishes him is who he says is coming next, which we're going to get into when Jesus gets into the scene. So I hope this has been a blessing, guys. I hope it's been informative, and I hope this is helpful in clarifying what's happening here in this densely packed Gospel of Mark. And so we unpack it and grasp what's actually going on here so we can respond to it and live for Christ without condition. Blessings.